Today I'm going to be discussing 5 tips that I learned from studying Black aristocrats that I think are going to help us get through these times we find ourselves in right now. My name is Raven Kushner. I am a fine art portrait painter. I paint images of Black wealth and visions for a post-racial America. Now, in saying that, it sounds strange because it's become abundantly apparent that we are not living in a post-racial America. But I'm a firm believer in the law of attraction. I believe that we speak the world that we want into existence with our thoughts, our words, and our actions. So although we find ourselves in some very tough times, I believe in being very strategic about how I'm going to be moving forward, and if these words help anyone else in moving forward during this time without changing your own character or lowering yourself to be something that you're not, then I hope you'll listen to the end and give me your feedback on if you think these suggestions are helpful. This is what I'm going to be doing, and if you find them helpful, let me know. So to start off, I wanted to explain a little bit about what I mean by Black aristocrats. Some people can almost think that's an oxymoron because unfortunately our brand in this society and even in the world has been one of struggle, of slavery, of all kinds of negativity that are not applicable obviously to all or even most of us, but that's the brand that stuck because that's what serves the interests of the powers that be. So what's important, though, is to realize that there have been aristocrats even before the end of slavery. People who were either fully Black, from usually they were immigrants, or sometimes they were descendants of slave owners, and there were also just free Black people. And they had property, they had money, and they had certain privileges. They were not the majority, of course, but they were always a contingent. And I'm speaking specifically of the Black aristocrats from the late 19th century to early 20th century. I began this journey as an artist painting Black aristocrats. I did a series called The Aristocrats, which you can find on my website. And it started because I was fascinated by this concept. I don't really remember how I first got into it. I was doing videos reviewing the Interview of the Vampire series, and I was first drawn to that series because the main character, Louis Dupoint-du-Lac, was one such aristocrat. He was the descendant of slave owners, it's assumed, and he was in charge of running their estate. So they had money and they had privileges, obviously not as much as white privilege, but he had certain privileges within that society, and it was just understood. And this was set in New Orleans, which was a unique American city because even during the times before slavery ended, there was a lot more categories of people, biracial people, they acknowledged them, and they had various levels of privilege and financial advantages. But with the end of slavery, there was the backlash. And so you had this group of aristocrats, Black aristocrats, who had money, who had education, who had connections to the power structure and so forth. But then you had the backlash, a few decades after slavery ended, and you had the beginning of Jim Crow. So I believe it really kind of parallels our current situation where we had this sort of heyday with 2 successful presidential terms of President Barack Obama, and there was this heyday for a while where it really looked like the human character was really making a turn for the better. And I think a lot of us had hopes, and we knew that we were not living in a post-racial America, but I think there was a hope that maybe humanity really was getting better. Maybe Americans were getting better. And then we see, just like with Jim Crow, we see the backlash. There are people that are determined not to let that happen. So we find ourselves in a similar point of view or perspective where it's not just a small number of aristocrats, where now there are a lot of us, women of color, people of color, immigrants, women making money and being independent. There's a certain level of comfort and privilege that a lot of us have achieved, and then now we see the backlash. We see the absolute misogyny against women. We're seeing an uptick in hate crimes and racial incidents of all stripes. So this is a time to be strategic. This really isn't a time for protest, in my opinion. Not that we shouldn't do protests, but that's not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to write letters. It's not even enough to have podcasts like this and videos and things like that. Like, that's great. And the advantage we do have is we have the internet. So we have each other. But I believe, and this is what I'm going to be practicing, we have to be very strategic about how we move forward. And that is what the other side, the advantage that they have, is that although they are ruthless and completely without morality, they are organized and they are very strategic about what they want. So we have to be just as strategic. We can't allow ourselves to live in a state of delusion or false hopes. We have to have hope that's based on God and who God is, but also on the actions that we take. So when I started reading about Aristocrats and doing my painting series, I told my mom about the series, and she actually sent me the funeral picture of a member of my own family who, his name is Junius George Groves, and he actually was one of these black aristocrats. He was a multi-million-dollar farmer and entrepreneur, and he died in the early 20th century. He's a great uncle by marriage. So I have the background, and in my family, I have people of this stature with the education, things like that. So in addition to that, I also did a lot of study of black aristocrats. And so here are the things that I've taken away that I'm applying to our current situation. So number one is, my advice is to know yourself and know it well. One thing that the aristocrats, the black aristocrats of that era, is they knew who they were. They were accused of wanting to be white, but in actually reading about them, they weren't trying to be anything other than they were. They were proud of who they were. They knew that they were special in a sense, and they took that very seriously. So the world is always going to try to define you in ways that benefit it. So it benefits the powers that be if you think that you are lesser than. If you think you're lesser than, you're going to buy stuff that you don't need. You're going to numb yourself out with drugs and with media and with wasting time, reality TV shows and things like that. And those things are all great, but it really matters who you think that you are, because that is going to shape what you say and what you do. And the biggest horror, the biggest sin that racism is that it teaches you to think of yourself as lesser than. If somebody's racist against you and they don't like you, that doesn't matter. But what does matter is when you allow that to turn into self-hatred. And that is what racism does. That's what large-scale rejection does. It's inevitable that most of us will have certain elements, if you're women, if you're gay, if you're any kind of marginalized community, there's going to be some level of that wants to come in because the societal voices are telling you that there's something wrong with you. It's your job, and it's my job, to reassert daily, hourly if necessary, who you actually are. That's first and foremost, because once you know who you are, it matters very little what other people say, and it gives you the strength to do the actions that you need to do. The second thing that the aristocrats were very good at is vetting the people that they allowed into their life. Now, they took criticism for this because they had a lot of balls and parties and events and organizations, and they did not invite everybody. They were very much for racial uplift, but in their social lives, they did not socialize with everyone. They didn't socialize with white people, for the most part, unless it was strategic. And they didn't socialize with the mass of black people, because the mass of black people were oppressed, and they still carried, unfortunately, a lot of oppressed mindset and behaviors. And so while the aristocrats wanted to help themselves and their fellow black Americans, they knew, either instinctively or through teachings, that it really matters who you associate yourself with. So for me personally, this whole election cycle was different than anything previously. And I have a zero tolerance. If you're on that side, if you looked at what was on offer and that seemed reasonable to you, I can be cordial, I can be kind, but you and I have nothing in common, and I'm not going to take you into my inner circle as an acquaintance, as a friend, as a lover, as any of the above, okay? Because if somebody grins in your face, but when it comes down to it, if they will do actions that will harm you, that is not somebody that you want to keep around in your personal life. You don't want to have to be looking over your shoulder all the time at people in your life. And even the people that are in your life currently, it needs to be updated, right? Do not feel bad about reevaluating the people that are in your life and asking yourself if they really do still bring value to your life, if they really are trusted people. And especially in terms of the election, if there are people in your life celebrating while there are people that are already facing harm and damage, people who have already been threatened with deportation, people who've been attacked, racial things, epithets thrown around. It's bad already, and it's just getting started. He hasn't even been sworn in yet, right? So it's very important. Don't be blind. In the nature of being kind, don't be stupid. Don't be delusional. You can be cordial without being duped. You have to have your boundaries in place, and you have to make people earn the privilege of being in your life. Number 3, the aristocrats were solid in their belief in education. They knew that as people of color, nothing was going to be given to them. And we see with this election, we see the disparity between somebody who is the most qualified woman in the world going up against somebody who not only was mediocre, but honestly would aspire to be mediocre. No moral compass, on and on and on. So you have these two going up against each other, and it shouldn't even be a conversation, and yet we see what privilege can do. So you and I don't have that, so it behooves us to educate ourselves. It behooves us to not waste time. It's just more serious now. We don't have hours to waste taking in media, playing video games, smoking weed or whatever. Not that I was doing, much of those things anyway, but it's very important now for you and I to get serious about how we spend our time and what we take into our consciousness. Because the thing is about education, and the aristocrats knew this, is that that's not something that can be taken from you once you have it. The thing is, every totalitarian regime focuses on controlling the media and dumbing down the populace, making it hard to get educated, banning books, things of this nature. They do that because an educated person is a free person. If you do not educate yourself now, while it's still legal, while it's still possible, then there is no excuse. Get yourself educated. And I don't necessarily mean getting a degree, but if that's what it takes to get where you need to be and stabilize yourself financially, obviously do that. What I'm talking about is knowing the reality and the truth of what's going on. It's not okay to not be educated. It's just not. So seize the day while we still can. Okay, the next thing, number 4, is use your wealth strategically. That is something that the aristocrats absolutely did. They used their money for a lot of charity, a lot of racial uplift stuff, a lot of educational resources. They were politically active, and they used their money and their privilege for good. Yes, they bought stuff too. There's nothing wrong with that. But using your money strategically is very important, especially because a lot of these people that voted against our interests are the ones that also want to sell us stuff, right? The audacity of that blows me away. But see, a lot of the things that they're selling, we don't need, right? Or we can source them from people that do have a moral compass and that do share our value system. So before you spend a dime, think long and hard about who are you enriching? Who are you empowering by this dollar that you're laying out, right? Are you making a vote with your dollars for your own oppression, or are you making a vote for a better future? So think very strategically about how you spend your money. And last but not least, number 5 is be very strategic about how you live your life. I am not the morality police. However, morality gives you power. It's not the same power that wealth gets you, but it is more solid and it is more long lasting, and it is something that you can lean on. So when you don't have privilege, you don't have a lot of wiggle room for mediocrity, as I've already talked about, for stupidity, for not being aware. There's just not a lot of wiggle room. So morality, unfortunately or fortunately, is on that same plate, right? It matters how you spend your time. It matters what you do with your life. This is not the time to be having unwed pregnancies, right? Things are going to get a lot tougher for most people, right? So this is not the time to be having unwed pregnancies. This is not the time to be indulging in, habits that don't add to your life. This isn't the time to be doing shady dealings and things like that. Like, there's just no wiggle room for that. And when there's nothing that someone can get you on, that is a power that you have. We see how stellar that you have to be. When you look at a Barack Obama or you look at a Kamala Harris, these people are stellar. They tried to go after them for ticky-tack things that didn't even make sense, especially in light of what they were opposing. But they will still try, and there's nothing. If there's nothing that they can get on you, then that is a feather in your cap. That is power in your hands, right? And it's power in your own life. Immorality is not something that you can get away with when your privileges are low and your finances are mediocre, right? It's just not. It affects your level of wealth, having unwed pregnancies, wasting money on drugs, wasting money on entertainment and media that's not, pushing your career or your life forward, getting into trouble with the law. These types of things, only hurt you. And especially when we're living in a society that refuses to see us as who we really are. And that's their business. Our job is to not only see ourselves as who we truly are, but to be the very best versions of ourselves that we can be, so that when we do our actions of resistance, which we will be doing with our art, with our career, with our dating practices, with our purchasing practices, all of this is going to be a reflection of the resistance. We are not going to just lay down and allow fascists and racists and bigots and greedy people destroy the country without us lifting a finger. We're going to do everything that we can do. And I think that if we start with these 5 things as pillars of how to move forward, I really think that during these next 4 years, even though it seems like really the darkest moment in my lifetime for sure, I think that there's a hidden silver lining. I think that we can really, because we are forced to really take this seriously, because we're up against so much, I honestly and truly believe that we can make an absolute transformation. But we have to stand strong. We cannot weaken. We cannot do this for a few days or a couple weeks and then go back to status quo. That's just not going to work. If people who are awake fall asleep at the wheel, then yes, we are hopeless. But if those of us that actually have a moral compass and care, if we stay awake, not for the next 2 weeks, but for the next several years and decades to come, we can hold the space for the world that works for all of us. So I'm really grateful that you're here, that you listened. Please check out my art. My art is all about racial uplift and envisioning the type of America that will make me and our descendants proud. So until next time, have a blessed day. Bye-bye.